Cognitive biases are systematic patterns of thought that influence our judgments and decisions, often in irrational ways. Confirmation bias is the tendency to favor information that supports our existing beliefs while ignoring contradictory evidence. For instance, a person who believes in a particular political ideology may only follow news sources that align with their views, reinforcing their convictions. Anchoring bias occurs when we rely too heavily on the first piece of information we receive when making a decision. A real-life example is when a store prices an item at $100, but then offers a discount to $80, making the discounted price seem more reasonable by comparison. The availability heuristic is a cognitive bias where we overestimate the importance of information that readily comes to mind. For example, after a plane crash, people may overestimate the risk of flying due to the vividness of the incident, despite air travel being statistically very safe. The representativeness heuristic is a bias where we judge the likelihood of an event based on how closely it resembles a typical case, rather than on the actual probabilities. A classic example is believing a person is more likely to be a librarian than a farmer based on their personality, simply because the person seems more book-smart, even if there are many more farmers in the population. The halo effect is the tendency to form an overall positive impression of a person based on a single trait or characteristic. For instance, if we find someone physically attractive, we may also assume they are intelligent and kind, even without evidence. The fundamental attribution error is the tendency to overestimate the role of character and underestimate the impact of situational factors in shaping behavior. A real-life example is when we attribute someone's failure to their supposed lack of ability, rather than to external circumstances. Hindsight bias is the tendency to believe, after an event has occurred, that we would have predicted it. For example, after a company goes bankrupt, we might say we knew it was coming, even if we had no way of knowing at the time. The self-serving bias is the tendency to attribute our successes to our own abilities, while blaming external factors for our failures. An example is when a student attributes their good grades to their intelligence and hard work, but blames a bad grade on the teacher or the exam being unfair. Loss aversion is the tendency to prefer avoiding losses to acquiring gains. A real-life example is when we are more motivated to avoid a $50 loss than to gain $50, even though the two outcomes have the same financial impact. The sunk cost fallacy is the tendency to continue investing in something because of the resources we have already committed, even if it no longer makes sense to do so. For example, if we buy a ticket to a concert that turns out to be terrible, we might stay until the end because we don't want to waste the money we spent, even if we would be better off leaving early. The gambler's fallacy is the tendency to assume that a random event is more likely to happen because it has not happened recently. A classic example is believing that a coin is more likely to land heads after a series of tails, even though the probability remains 50%. The availability cascade is a self-reinforcing cycle where a collective belief gains momentum and becomes more widespread, often without being based on fact. A real-life example is when a rumor spreads quickly through social media, with each person who shares it adding to its apparent credibility, regardless of its truth. The Baader-Meinhof Phenomenon, also known as the frequency illusion, occurs when we start noticing a pattern or a word, and then see it everywhere, even though its actual frequency hasn't changed. For instance, if we buy a new car, we might suddenly notice the same make and model everywhere on the road, when in fact they were always there. The illusion of control is the tendency to overestimate the degree of control we have over events that are actually determined by chance. A real-life example is when a person believes that their actions, such as wearing a lucky charm, can influence the outcome of a random event, like a lottery drawing. Framing effect is the tendency to be influenced by the way information is presented rather than the information itself. For example, a product labeled as 90% fat-free might seem more appealing than one labeled as 10% fat, even though they have the same nutritional content. The Dunning-Kruger effect is the tendency for people who are incompetent in a particular domain to overestimate their own abilities, while underestimating the abilities of others. A real-life example is when someone with no medical training believes they can diagnose complex medical conditions, while dismissing the opinions of actual doctors. The actor-observer bias is the tendency to attribute our own behavior to situational factors, while attributing the behavior of others to their character. For instance, if we are late to a meeting, we might blame traffic, but if someone else is late, we might attribute it to their lack of punctuality. The effect heuristic is the tendency to make judgments based on our emotions, rather than on objective facts. A real-life example is when we decide to support a charity because we are emotionally moved by a particular story, rather than because of the charity's actual effectiveness. The door-in-the-face technique is a persuasion tactic where someone makes an initial request that is likely to be rejected in order to make a subsequent request seem more reasonable by comparison. For example, a salesperson might ask for a large donation, knowing it will be rejected, in order to make a smaller donation seem more acceptable. The foot-in-the-door technique is the opposite approach, where someone makes a small, initial request that is likely to be accepted in order to set the stage for a larger request later on. A classic example is when a charity asks for a small donation and then follows up with a request for a larger contribution. The bystander effect is the tendency for individuals to be less likely to help someone in distress when there are other people present, due to a diffusion of responsibility. A real-life example is when a crowd of people fails to intervene in a crime because each individual assumes someone else will take responsibility. The IKEA effect is the tendency to overvalue something because we had a hand in its creation, such as assembling a piece of furniture. For instance, we might be more satisfied with a meal we cooked ourselves, even if it's not as good as a meal cooked by someone else. The Ben Franklin effect is the tendency to like someone more after we have done a favor for them, due to our brain's attempt to justify the effort we put in. A real-life example is when we begin to appreciate a person more after we have invested time and energy into helping them. The pratfall effect is the tendency to like someone more after they have made a mistake, as it makes them seem more human and vulnerable. For example, if a public figure admits to a mistake, we might find them more relatable and endearing. The spotlight effect is the tendency to overestimate the amount of attention that other people are paying to us. A real-life example is when we assume everyone notices our new haircut, when in fact most people are too caught up in their own lives to pay attention. The illusion of asymmetric insight is the tendency to believe that we have a more nuanced and accurate understanding of ourselves than we do of others. For instance, we might assume that our own motivations and thoughts are complex and multifaceted, while believing that others are simpler and more one-dimensional. The false consensus effect is the tendency to overestimate the extent to which others agree with us. A real-life example is when we assume that most people share our opinions and values, when in fact they may be more divided. The backfire effect is the tendency for people to cling to their beliefs even more strongly when presented with contradictory evidence. For example, if someone is presented with facts that challenge their conspiracy theory, they might become even more convinced that the theory is true. Cognitive biases can have significant impacts on our personal and professional lives, influencing everything from our relationships to our financial decisions. By understanding these biases and how they work, we can take steps to mitigate their effects and make more informed choices. Ultimately, recognizing and addressing cognitive biases is an ongoing process that requires self-reflection, critical thinking, and a willingness to challenge our own assumptions and beliefs. By doing so, we can become more aware of our own thought patterns and make more rational decisions that align with our goals and values.